Welcome to Love Lies Chronicles.
I'd really appreciate your comment. It helps me understand if you enjoyed the story and how I can improve in future ones. My name is Aaron Blake. I'm 37 years old, a project manager for a logistics firm in Denver. It was a Wednesday night, the kind that smells like old coffee and freeway air. I set my laptop bag by the couch, loosened my tie, and walked into the kitchen to the soft hum of the fridge and the hard glow of her phone. She was leaning against the counter, scrolling, thumbs moving fast. She didn't look up when I came in. That wasn't new anymore. What was new were the late-night calls, the balcony whispers, and the way the joint account kept bleeding small amounts that added up to a real number. It started with patterns, meetings running long, but she was in gym clothes. A new contact at the top of her messages, no last name, just an initial. The laugh that used to be mine turned sideways at a screen. I told myself it was a busy season for both of us. I told myself to be patient. Then I started seeing the charges. $38 to a delivery place nowhere near our house. Rideshare receipts at midnight that didn't match her calendar. Zelle. Emergency in the memo line. I keep budgets for a living. I know the rhythm of a normal month, and this wasn't it. The first time I asked, she said it was a colleague going through something. She made it sound harmless, like she was picking up soup for someone sick. The next week I saw a $250 transfer with no label at all. I asked again, and she rolled her eyes like I'd asked where she hid the chocolates. If there was nothing to hide, the answer would have been simple. Instead, she changed the subject to a show she wanted to watch and handed me the remote like a pacifier. 2 days later, I came home early and caught her on the balcony with her back to the glass. Voice low, the kind of tone you save for the past or a future you shouldn't be building. I stood there long enough to hear a name I recognized from stories that used to end with, "I'm glad it didn't work out." Her ex, the one from the era before me, the one who taught her what she didn't want. I sat on the arm of the couch and watched the last of the sun slide off the neighbor's roof, counting breaths until she came in. I wish I could say I confronted her with something clever. When she slid the door shut, I asked who needed that much help this late. She said a friend. I asked which friend. She said I wouldn't know him. The pronoun did the work for me. There was nothing dramatic in my tone, just basic arithmetic. I opened the banking app and scrolled. "We're covering a lot of emergencies lately," I said. "Are we sponsoring somebody?" That earned me a smirk and a sigh, the kind people give a child who won't drop a toy. The next morning I brewed coffee, poured 2 mugs, and placed one where hers always sat. She took it without a word and set it by her phone, screen down, like I might read through the ceramic. I told her I didn't like joint funds drifting toward an old chapter of her life, and that secrecy made it worse. She called me controlling, not angry, calm, like she was slotting me into a category she'd rehearsed. A man who notices is a man who polices. That was the logic. I replayed our old conversations on my drive to work, hunting for the moment she reopened that door. There were breadcrumbs I'd stepped over. An Instagram like that shouldn't have mattered, but it was on a photo I knew was his. A story share about a fundraiser he was organizing. The kind that never quite reaches the goal, but always needs one more boost. A throwaway comment about how not everyone is as stable as you, said like a compliment and used like a wedge. Stability can be made into an insult if you season it with enough boredom. That week I stopped by the bank in person to ask about setting alerts for transfers over a certain amount. The teller asked if I was planning a trip. I said I was planning to notice. I drove home slowly, rehearsing sentences that wouldn't sound like accusations. I wanted to be precise. If there was a reasonable explanation, I'd leave the door open for it. That night was when she said the line I won't forget. I asked her to sit at the table and she stayed standing, one hip against the counter like she had a bus to catch. I mentioned the numbers again, 20 here, 100 there, 254 rent gap. I said the name I'd heard on the balcony. She didn't blink. Just a flat voice to the room, to her phone, to anyone but me. Helping him is my right, whether you like it or not. It was the posture, the refusal to offer me the courtesy of eye contact while dismissing our life together like a budget line she didn't answer to. Indifference is heavier than anger. Anger at least has energy. This was vacancy. I rinsed my cup and set it upside down on the rack, listening to water find the drain. I've managed hot-headed drivers and brittle vendors. I know when pushing makes things worse. I thanked her for being clear. She laughed once, short, like I'd misread the joke. Clarity has a way of reorganizing your house in an hour. I walked through our rooms with a new inventory. The shared dresser suddenly felt like a ledger we weren't balancing. The shelf by the door where we tossed keys looked like a lost and found bin. I stood in the doorway of the spare room we kept empty for projects and pictured a duffel on the floor and a lock on the doorframe. I slept on my side of the bed that night and noticed how much space I'd been crossing to meet her lately. There's a way a body turns away that becomes practice, not accident. I counted the seconds between the light going off and the glow of her screen sneaking back under the covers. I wondered how many of those seconds I was supposed to pretend were normal. In the morning, I changed my emergency contact at work to my brother. I told myself it was for a training he'd asked about, nothing more. I moved the passport to the top drawer. I adjusted 2 auto-pay settings that always made me nervous anyway. Little things. Quiet things. If anyone had asked, I would have said I was getting organized. I didn't tell her about any of it. I made eggs. I asked if she wanted toast. She said she wasn't hungry and left her plate empty beside a phone that buzzed 3 times and went still. When the door closed behind her, I sat at the table and listened to the house breathe. Kitchens are honest places. If a sentence can stand up in a kitchen, it usually stands up anywhere. Helping him is my right, she'd said. I didn't say anything out loud, but the answer formed anyway, simple and quiet, as obvious as a balanced column. If she could dismiss me that easily, I could remove myself just as easily. I needed a plan. And plans begin with noticing where the money goes, where the eyes go, where the respect goes when no one thinks you're looking. After that night, she refined her talking points. Compassion, autonomy, my right. The words were polished smooth by repetition. The behaviors around them got sharper. The phone lived face down on tables. Calls drifted later, then later still, her voice thinning on the balcony until it was more wind than sentence. Transfers went from forgettable to measurable. What used to be a trickle through our joint account began to sound like a leak you can hear in the drywall if you stand very still. I built a quiet ledger that no one but me would see. Date, amount, memo, location. 10 here, 50 there, 300 with a note that read, rent gap. As if our marriage were a charity she could name without a board. I'm a practical one. I flagged the pattern because that's what I do when something repeats. A pattern is either a plan or negligence. Either way, it deserved one honest conversation. I brought it up over dinner, plates still warm from the oven. I slid a folded sheet of paper to the edge of her placemat and asked if there was a plan I should understand. She barely glanced before pushing it back with 2 fingers. He'd lost a job, she said. He needed a bridge. I asked why the bridge was built out of our savings. She lifted her shoulders, a little shrug that said I was making a big deal out of a decent act. You're stable, she added, like it was a diagnosis. Not everyone is. It wasn't a fight. I said joint money is for joint goals. Mortgage, roof, medical, the 100 dull essentials no one posts about. She said I was reducing love to line items. I said I was protecting what we built. She said if my masculinity was threatened by her generosity, that sounded like a me problem. I took a breath and let the sentence sit there until it sagged under its own posture. A day later her mother called, sunny voice with a hard edge underneath. She told me you're upset she's helping someone in need, she said, as if I'd kicked a donation bucket at church. I told her I was concerned about boundaries and budgets. She suggested I be proud to be married to such a giving soul. When I hung up, I realized the narrative had left the house. I was no longer a husband with questions. I was an obstacle quoted in a group chat. I waited until she came home before I asked the only question that matters when you feel the floor tilt. Is there someone else? For words. She smiled without showing teeth and set her purse down. There's always someone else to help, she said, a non-answer in address. I changed the wording. Are you in love with him again? Her eyes flicked past me to the corner of the room, as if the wall might cue her line. Don't be insecure, Aaron, she said. It's ugly. The support she provided expanded from money to errands that bent our evenings around another man's calendar. She started picking up groceries that never reached our fridge. Bags of staples lined the hallway for drop-offs on the way. The language of triage crept in, urgent, crisis, emergency, until every day required a fresh act of salvation. Compassion felt less like a virtue and more like a schedule she didn't have to clear with me. At a friend's patio dinner, she told a story about stepping up when others won't. carefully stripping names while leaving just enough detail for anyone watching us to assemble the picture. People murmured approval. Someone called her an angel. I sipped water and studied the wood grain in the table. There's a special kind of pressure in being performed around. You become scenery for a scene you didn't block. The money kept moving. One Saturday morning, I saw a transfer over breakfast that equaled a car payment. I set my mug down and said, calmly, that I wouldn't approve any more loans to her ex from our joint account. Approve? She echoed, as if I'd mispronounced a word in her language. I'm not asking. She started using her card, then reimbursing herself from the joint a day later, feigning forgetfulness. I logged it without comment. It's amazing how quickly a house teaches you which conversations are now pointless. She curated witnesses. A cousin texted for the first time in a year to tell me that controlling money to control a woman is abuse. A friend of hers posted an inspirational quote about wives who refuse to dim their light, followed by a heart and a key emoji. I don't believe in coincidences that arrive on cue. One night the dryer finished and beeped in the laundry closet, a bright domestic sound cutting through the hush. She was lacing shoes in the entryway. It was after 11. I asked where. He's having a panic attack, she said, tapping the laces tight. He needs someone. I looked at the basket of clean clothes. Our life folded into rectangles that would wait until morning. He has someone, I said. He has you. She opened the door and left it open behind her like the rest of the sentence was mine to close. She came back at 2:30. She looked at the light on and shook her head. This is exactly what I mean, she said, stepping out of her shoes. You create drama. The script had upgraded while she was out. My quiet was now proof of noise. I turned the lamp off and listened to the house to remind myself what silence actually sounded like. At some point, compassion became currency. She paid it out and expected a return in status, halo points that would cover the bill at home. Meanwhile, the ledger in my desk kept catching her new math. She framed it as me versus him, as if I were vying for a slot on her calendar like a second shift volunteer. I was measuring, and measurement is a decision warming its hands. I did speak once more, because a clean record matters before you act. Sunday afternoon light cut through the blinds in bands and put stripes across the floor. I told her I didn't want our marriage to be the subsidy for a relationship she wasn't willing to name. I said I would not argue about kindness, but I would not finance ambiguity. She held my gaze this time and smiled like a disappointed teacher. You can't stand not being the center, she said. It's sad. My brother asked if I was okay. I said yes, because I was. You can be okay and done at the same time. At work, I moved deadlines forward a week so nothing would depend on me while I wasn't available. At home, I stopped proposing solutions. I vacuumed. I changed a bulb. I oiled the hinge that squeaked every night when she went to the balcony to make another call. Small repairs keep your hands busy while your mind packs boxes you're not ready to carry. She celebrated tiny victories in front of me, an extra 100 found for his copay, a landlord mollified by a promise I didn't make. Every rescue pulled her further away from us and closer to a role she liked better than wife, savior. The distance wasn't measured in feet, but in plots. The story she was living didn't have room for me except as foil. In the middle of all that, I noticed something ordinary and decisive. I didn't ask where she was going when she grabbed her keys. I felt the pressure, yes, but from far away, like weather I'd already accounted for. The boundary line she kept pressing against went solid inside me. No more measuring. I had enough numbers. The next part wouldn't be about counting. It would be about the cost. Clarity doesn't arrive with a burst of energy. It settles like dust after a wall comes down. The morning after I realized the boundary had gone solid inside me, I made coffee, set 2 mugs on the counter, and placed a single page between them. 3 lines. End all financial and personal involvement with him. Reimburse the joint account for every transfer I logged. Do it by tomorrow at 8 p.m., or we separate. A deadline is merciful because it replaces argument with time. I cleaned the French press and watched the grounds funnel toward the drain. On my phone, I set a countdown that only I could see. 24 hours. The number looked small, almost friendly. That was the point. If a marriage needs more than a day to choose itself, it's already chosen something else. Control isn't loud. It's a series of small, deliberate motions. I scanned the ledger and emailed a PDF to myself and to a new encrypted address I'd created months earlier when the first transfer felt wrong. I photographed the contents of the house room by room, the way you do before you move or before you admit you should. I gathered the documents that matter: passport, birth certificate, titles. I slid them into a folder with a zip and tucked it under the jacket I wear when Denver pretends it's still winter. Work was useful because it reminded me I can steer moving parts without clenching my jaw. I sent 3 emails pulling deadlines forward, made a call to a general counsel I sometimes consult with, and set a short meeting with an attorney for the next afternoon. Not for drama, for structure. If a bridge must be crossed, you check its load rating before you drive over it. By lunch, I had opened a new personal account at a bank we'd never used, redirected my direct deposit, and turned off overdraft protection linked to the joint. Auto pays for the mortgage and utilities stayed where they were. A man doesn't punish a house. Streaming, shopping, and discretionary subscriptions moved with 2 taps and a confirmation code. I removed an authorized user from an old card and cut the spare plastic into neat pieces that fit into the palm of my hand. Not an accusation, just one more line in the plan. I packed in silence that evening. A duffel with 3 days of clothes. A backpack with a laptop, chargers, and the folder that now had the weight of a different life. Toiletries went into the travel kit I keep ready for conferences. I placed the duffel in the trunk of my car and left the backpack by the door behind the coat rack, a shadow among shadows. I said the deadline once more, but not as an argument. Tomorrow. 8. That was the whole sentence. She laughed like someone told a joke I'd missed. The balcony door slid open later. Voices rose and fell and braided into the steady hiss of traffic on the avenue. I didn't listen for words. Half listening is how men learn to tolerate what breaks them. I read a chapter of a book about mountain passes and weather patterns instead. People call it distraction. I call it remembering there is a world beyond the edge of your house. Morning, the clock ticked down past 20 hours. I sent a final text at 8:01 a.m. So there would be a record that wasn't paper. 24 hours. End it. Reimburse. Or we separate. No emojis to sand the corners off the truth. The dots appeared, then stopped, then appeared again. Nothing landed. Silence, properly kept, is not a void. It's a container. I put the phone face down and went to work. The day moved like a machine that had been waiting for permission. I met the attorney over lunch at a place with tall windows and a slightly chipped table that made the formality easier. We spoke in nouns, not metaphors. Separation. Asset protection. Documentation. He told me what I already knew. Keep records, stay calm. Don't telegraph moves that invite performance. I paid, shook his hand, and walked into weak winter sun feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. At 5 p.m., I drove by a short-term corporate apartment I'd reserved online with a flexible lease. A furnished one-bedroom with a small balcony and a view of a row of elms that would be green again in 3 months. The manager slid a key card across the counter without looking up from his screen. Keys are a kind of punctuation. Periods end a sentence. A key card is more like a line break. Not the end, but clearly not the same paragraph. Back at the house, the countdown slipped under 3 hours. She was at the table, tapping messages with one hand and stirring tea with the other. On the counter sat a shopping bag with groceries that weren't ours. I didn't ask who they were for. The clock I'd set on my phone hit 90 minutes and turned the numbers red as if to dramatize what didn't need drama. I made dinner for myself, ate at the counter, rinsed the plate, and left it in the rack to dry. Routine keeps your hands honest while your life changes shape. 40 minutes. She put on shoes. The balcony call became a hallway call became a front door opening. Without looking up, she said something about compassion, about not abandoning people when they're down. I wasn't a panel to be addressed. 30 minutes. I went to the bedroom and stood at the window, watching the parking lot fill with neighbors returning to lives that were, for tonight, still symmetrical. At 8, the clock hit 0. No reimbursement. In the kitchen, the note I'd written lay under the corner of a placemat, as if it were a mailer no one asked for. I placed my wedding ring on the dresser, centered between 2 knots in the wood I'd always thought looked like eyes. I left my house key on the hook by the door and kept the car key. I slid the backpack straps over my shoulders, lifted the handle on the duffel in the trunk, and eased the door closed behind me so the latch wouldn't echo down the hall. One light was on in the living room. I didn't turn back to switch it off. Let it burn for one night. A lighthouse for no one. On the landing, I met the quiet that belongs to stairwells, the kind that smells like dust and old paint and other people's dinner. Each step was a sentence I didn't need to speak. Outside, Denver's cold found the skin of my neck and convinced me to raise the collar. I walked to the car, opened the trunk, and put my hand on the duffel for a second longer than necessary. The drive to the apartment was clean. No music, just the throb of tires over seams in the asphalt. I parked under a lamp, carried the bag up, and let myself in. The room was what the photos promised. A couch that would survive 5 more tenants, a table that could be a desk, a bed with a frame that didn't pretend to be anything else. I put the folder in the top dresser drawer, the laptop on the table, and the phone on the counter. I texted my brother 2 words, all set. I powered the phone down. There's a temptation, even for calm men, to send one last message to explain the shape of the hole you've left. I didn't. Explanation is a service. Services are for agreements. The ultimatum wasn't a threat, it was a mirror. She could look or not. Midnight came without a knock. Morning would come too. In the silence of that new room, I realized the walkout wasn't rage or retreat. It was alignment. I had given a day because a day is humane. When nothing changed, I changed the only variable I control, proximity. One way doesn't mean forever, it means no more circles. If she wanted to call it abandonment, the mirror was still there, available and unpaid. I lay back on the bed and listened to the building breathe. Somewhere, a refrigerator motor kicked on. Somewhere else, a man coughed and a child laughed. Clarity is the sound a key makes when it moves easily in the right lock. The first morning in the corporate apartment felt like waking up in a hotel booked by a calmer version of myself. I made coffee with the single-serve machine, watched steam rise in a room that didn't know my name, and turned my phone on. No alarms. Just a tall column of messages poured in while it slept. Paragraphs about vows, fragments about compassion. I scrolled to the end and powered the phone back down. Silence was the only way to keep the ultimatum honest after it expired. By noon, I had 2 voicemails from her mother, one from a cousin I barely knew, and a text from a friend who didn't waste words. She moved in with him. You should know. No flourish. Just the line I'd already drawn coming true in the space I'd left. A half hour later, an email from the bank flagged an attempt to move money from the joint that no longer connected to my income. Declined. The system used the same language I'd been using, insufficient funds for that kind of withdrawal. I set new routines because routine absorbs impact. Gym after work. Groceries small enough to carry in one hand. A run around the block to learn the rhythm of a neighborhood that wasn't mine yet. At night, I sat at the little table and revised budgets like the project plan had shifted phases. 2 households, 1 car, 1 mortgage for now, until the paper caught up to the fact of it. She reached for guilt first. A string of texts about how men don't abandon their wives when someone else needs help. How my ultimatum proved I wasn't the steady man she fell in love with. How walking out was emotional violence. I read every word once and filed them mentally beside the earlier words about autonomy. The definitions changed to suit the lesson of the day. I kept the phone on, do not disturb, and let each new alert slide into the archive without earning a response. After guilt came blame. You pushed me to this. You made me feel worthless. I had to go somewhere I mattered. Somewhere was the ex's apartment on the south side of the city, a 3rd-floor walk-up with a broken porch light. Friends sent what people send in 2025 when they want you to believe them. Screenshots, timestamps, location tags. The story didn't require my presence. It was happening in public, like everything else she'd curated. Seduction tried to make a late entrance. A photo of her in the sweater I used to compliment, a message about missing my hands, about how we were bigger than this. The word sat on my lock screen like a sale email for a product I'd already returned. I answered once, so the boundary would be on record. For logistics, contact my attorney. I pasted the name and number. She replied in seconds, "You're really doing this?" I was. I turned the phone face down again and let the attorney earn his fee. I heard about her new household the way weather rolls in. First as rumor, then as damp air, then as a steady rain. He wasn't working, that much was clear. He had plans, of course. Men like that are rich in plans and poor in proof. She covered groceries at first and called it temporary. Then she paid his phone bill and called it an emergency. Then came rent. She framed the transfers as investments in a future version of him that never arrived. The same grammar she'd used on me now had to stretch across a man who didn't even pretend to be stable. Her family's script started skipping. Her mother asked if I could float her half of the mortgage while she gets on her feet. I told her the auto pays were still running and the house would not suffer. I told her any other support would go through counsel. She said I was being cold. The social circle adjusted too. At a friend's birthday, people who had treated me like a suspect the month before shook my hand longer than usual, eyes soft with an apology they didn't quite know how to phrase. One asked how I was holding up. I said I was sleeping fine and meant it. Another said she'd heard my wife was helping someone heal. I said we were separated and let the sentence end there. Adults understand punctuation. Panic arrived at 2:30 on a Tuesday. A voicemail, her voice raw and fast, asking me to answer, saying the landlord was on the way with a notice, saying she didn't know who else to call. I listened once with my thumb hovering over the redial just to test if there was any version of me left who would run toward a fire simply because I was good at extinguishing them. I forwarded the message to my attorney and slept. 2 days later, a mutual friend asked me to meet for coffee. He landed on the point quickly. He's not even pretending, he said. She covers everything. He sleeps till 10 and calls it mindfulness. I stirred my cup and let the detail pass through me without catching. He studied my face, waiting for anger or grief. I told him the plan hadn't changed and that I appreciated the concern. On the way out, he put a hand on my shoulder and said he was sorry he hadn't seen it sooner. I told him it wasn't his job to see what people hide from themselves. Back at the apartment, the days stacked neatly. Work, gym, dinner for one, a book. I set up automatic transfers to savings like a man reintroducing himself to the basics. The ring sat in the top drawer under a folded t-shirt. Sometimes I opened the drawer just to confirm the object was still where I left it because I wanted proof that I could leave something important alone. She tried one more angle, public performance. Photos appeared online of her cooking in a kitchen that wasn't ours, captions about building again, about supporting dreams. The comments under them went from hearts to questions to quiet as the weeks stretched. Dreams cost money. People tire of clapping when the hat keeps making the rounds. When the post stopped mentioning me as the villain and started omitting him as the hero, I understood that the arc had bent to its obvious shape. My attorney forwarded an email from hers. It was careful and cautious, tone lowered from the speeches I had been receiving directly. Words like settlement and disclosure replaced words like loyalty and cruelty. We scheduled a meeting. On the morning of it, I ironed a shirt and shaved with the cheap bathroom mirror that always fogged at the top. The reflection looked rested. A year of marriage could live in a single month if you let it. She didn't show to the first meeting. Her lawyer apologized and cited a personal matter. The second meeting held. She was smaller there than she had been in our kitchen, no script about compassion to lean on. We spoke through attorneys, which is another way of saying we used fewer words and did more math. When it ended, she glanced up once, like she wanted to recognize the man she'd been practicing against. I nodded as you would to a neighbor in an elevator and left. I learned the rest in fragments. Late rent notices, a job he almost took, the fundraiser that didn't fund, the couch that became his workstation, and her bed. None of it changed my part. My silence was a refusal to re-enlist. Consequences aren't revenge, they're gravity. You step off a thing you were warned about, and you fall. My only task was to stop standing underneath, arms out, pretending I could catch what never wanted to land. When I turned the apartment light off that night, I realized there hadn't been a single dramatic moment, no grand gesture to frame the chapter. Just choices. Hers collected around a man who loved being carried. Mine collected around a woman who mistook sacrifice for proof. In the end, both stories broke where they had to. She went where she'd been walking for months. I kept walking in the other direction and found, to my quiet surprise, the ground held. The weeks after the second attorney meeting lined up like pallets in a quiet warehouse, labeled, stacked, easy to count. We traded documents, signed disclosures, and converted old arguments into columns that could be balanced. I went to work, paid the bills that were still mine to pay, and let the apartment learn my routine. A plant in the window, a mug that lived on the same coaster. Sneakers by the door pointed outward, because I was. News about her arrived in pieces, the way radio stations fade in and out on a long stretch of highway. A friend texted that the photos stopped. Another mentioned she'd taken her account private after a comment section turned into questions about rent. I didn't chase details. You don't need satellite imagery when you already know the terrain. Then one night, after a late gym session, I got the piece that clicked the others together. A buddy from our group thread called and said he'd run into a mutual acquaintance from her office. He never worked, the guy had said. Not once. He lived off her. Groceries, rent, his phone, rides, everything. While she was pulling from your joint. And now she left him. Again. I let the words sit on the dashboard glow while the engine cooled. He never worked. Lived off her. Left him again. None of it surprised me, but hearing it in a full sentence made it feel finished. A circle closed exactly where it had started, with a man who needed and a woman who paid. The difference now was that I wasn't underwriting the lesson. The next morning, I met my attorney to finalize the terms we'd carved out of what used to be a life. We talked about numbers, the only language both sides seemed willing to honor at the end. I kept the house. She took equity less the documented transfers that had turned our marriage into an ATM for a past she couldn't let go. Retirement accounts were split by formula. The joint account was closed for good. When the pen left the page, the room felt bigger than it had any right to. Like someone had opened a window I hadn't noticed was painted shut. On the way back to the apartment, I stopped by the house with a mover and 2 empty bins. My name was still on the deed. I had keys again. There was no drama to be explained to neighbors. I walked through rooms that held both of us and realized they were holding only air now. Her things were already gone. The places where they had been looked like chalk outlines on a sidewalk after the rain. I took what was mine and practical. Tools, books, the grill she always said smelled like summer, the framed map of mountain passes I'd promised myself I'd drive one day. I left the rest for the cleaners and the realtor we'd already chosen together by not choosing to live there together. 2 days later, she sent an email, not a text. Subject line: "Can we talk like adults?" The body was a soft apology stitched to a plea. She regretted how things unfolded. She was reevaluating friendships. She wanted to have a real conversation without lawyers. There was a line about how I'd always been the stable one, and how stability takes on a different glow after a storm. It read like a weather report written for tourists. I didn't reply, not out of spite. Out of respect, for the boundary, for the fact that I meant what I said when I walked out at 8 and didn't return at 9. Explanation would have been a service. Services are for agreements, and we didn't have one left. Friends kept trying to fill silence with their own sense-making. One said she'd moved in with a cousin across town. Another said she was applying for jobs with a look that suggested she'd skipped a step 10 years back. A third admitted he'd unfollowed her because the whiplash between martyrdom and marketing was too much before coffee. I nodded, thanked them for caring, and changed the subject to something that had a beginning, middle, and end. Basketball scores, a new Mediterranean place near my office, the way the light finds the elms outside my apartment right before sunset. The settlement cleared. The mortgage auto pay came from my account alone and felt lighter than it had when 2 names sat on the paperwork. I drove to the house on a Saturday, opened windows in every room, and let air roll in until the old paint smell gave up. A handyman replaced the squeaky hinge I'd oiled for months. I painted the spare room a color that meant nothing to anyone but me. Then I locked the door and left, certain I'd be back when I actually wanted to live there rather than prove I could. She tried once more, a short message on a Sunday afternoon. "I'm sorry. No qualifiers." It was the best version of a thing that arrived a year late. I typed 2 words and deleted them. Not cruel ones, just a polite acknowledgement that would invite a reply. I closed the app instead and stood at the window until the feeling passed. Forgiveness doesn't always require a conversation. Sometimes it's a choice you make in a room by yourself, followed by doing nothing that would make you relitigate it. A different friend, the one who had told me she left him, met me for a beer and said he'd heard the ex had moved on to a new couch. The phrase was unkind but accurate. People who live on other people don't resign without a better offer. He asked if I felt vindicated. I told him the truth. No. Vindication is for contests. The only scoreboard that mattered was inside me, and it read the same number it had read since the ultimatum: respect or nothing. I paid bills on time, worked hard, lifted heavier than last month, slept through the night. I changed my emergency contact back to my brother and added a note to call him before anyone else explains my life to him. I visited my parents' graves and sat long enough to feel the cold through my coat. I booked a solo drive through the passes on that map. I told no one the dates. When I came back, the plant in the window had collapsed under its own optimism. I watered it anyway, and 2 weeks later it remembered how to reach up. Sometimes I hear a car that sounds like hers and feel nothing. Other times I pass a balcony conversation and know exactly what the man inside is deciding not to overhear. The world is full of reruns if you keep cable. I turn mine off. If there's a moral here, it isn't clever. She believed helping him was her right, even if it emptied what we built. I believed walking away was mine, even if it emptied rooms I'd paid to fill. Both of us exercised a choice. The difference is I'm living with mine in peace. She's living with hers in motion. A month after the decree arrived, a mutual friend said she was thinking about reaching out to me for closure. I told him I hope she finds it, and that my part is already closed. He nodded like he wanted to argue and couldn't find a reason. On my way home, I stopped at a red light and looked up at a sky that didn't know my name and didn't need to. The line she threw like a law, "Helping him is my right," sounded smaller now, like a slogan pinned to a jacket someone outgrew. I outwalked it. Respect is not negotiable. You don't haggle for it or finance it or bleed out in the name of it. You either live in its house or you pack a bag and go. I went. And when a mutual friend later told me she'd left him again and was starting over again, I felt exactly what a man should feel when a storm finally passes over a city he no longer lives in. Nothing at all.
Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.